Good evening. It's good to see everyone this evening. We are studying what we call Beyond the Exile being the time that they spent in Babylon. And we've been covering the various books that are related to that. We really only have one more book after the one we're dealing with tonight, and that book would be Malachi. However, we've already looked at the synagogue when Kirk Brothers was with us. We still need to be looking at the period of time between the Testaments, which really doesn't have a book per se associated with it, but we'll talk about some of that when we get to it. And we also want to talk a little bit about the formation of the various sects, S-E-C-T-S, sects. That's hard to say. Okay, but that would be like the Sadducees, Pharisees, the Essenes, which are almost unheard of, and yet they're the ones who took care of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then you've also got the Zealots, who were the most, they were military almost in their thinking. They were rebels against Rome. All those we need to look at. We may do that in the Between the Testaments things. And we may look briefly at Daniel, because though Daniel was written in the exile, he did a lot of writing about what was going to happen after the exile, particularly about Antiochus Epiphanes. And we may talk a little bit about that as well. So we're in Nehemiah chapter 5. Now, if you've looked at this book, you know that there are 14 chapters to the book, and we will not cover every chapter. What we're going to do is zero in on some highlights that hopefully get your appetite whetted so that you want to look at it more in the future. Chapter 5, there's a problem that is presented to Nehemiah. It's in the opening verses, and some of the people are saying, we, in order to eat, and in order to pay our taxes, we've had to sell our children into slavery, and we're being charged interest, and we're not going to be able to live without selling ourselves into slavery. Nehemiah is enraged by the whole concept. You see that particularly the beginning of verse 6, and I became very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. After serious thought, I rebuked the nobles and the rulers and said to them, each of you is exacting usury from your brother. That's against the law. Did you know that? It's against the law of Moses to charge interest to a Jewish brother. Now, specifically it says you can charge interest to a foreigner. You can do that, but you cannot charge interest to a brother. I'll give you a few references if you'd like to look those up later. You've got, some of them are here, I think, a little bit, but you've got Exodus chapter 22, verse 25. I believe Leviticus chapter 25 is here, verses 35 and 36. You've also got Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 19 and 20. And then Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 12. And all that indicates God does not approve of charging interest of a brother. And yet that's exactly what they're doing. And what does Nehemiah, how does he respond to that? Too many times we resolve to take care of these things behind the scenes. We don't make any public spectacle. That's not the way it is. Look at the end of that 7th verse. So I called a great assembly against them. It is my belief from all that I read in Scripture that it's imperative that sin, number 1, be punished, number 2, be punished quickly, and number 3, be punished in such a way that other people know to fear. One of the biggest problems we got right now is in this nation is a judicial system that is totally bogged down, so that sometimes a trial doesn't come up for years, literally, and then an individual may be considered guilty and spend the bulk of a lifetime, behind bars instead of being meted out whatever punishment, particularly the death penalty. That's just, virtually unheard of anymore. It's not a good plan. I can demonstrate that in the New Testament, where it says don't rebuke an elder except with 2 or 3 witnesses. And then it said, but those that sin, you rebuke them publicly. Why? So that everybody will fear. See, Nehemiah understands that, and he acts on it. Now, at the end of the chapter, he deals with his approach to being governor. And his approach was he wouldn't take any money. Instead, he basically fed everybody out of his own pocket. He didn't allow even the people who sat at his table to get somebody else to pay for it. He did it himself. And here comes one of the big things. If I were looking for a key word in Nehemiah, and one of these days I'll probably write a sermon out of it, it's the word remember. Remembers in chapter 1, remembers here. He does it over and over again. He talks about remember. Here he says, verse 19, remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. He wants God to remember him because he did what was right. He did what was right in reference to the problem the people had with the interest being charged. He did what was right, and really went beyond what was right when he refused to allow the people to pay for him as governor to have whatever it took to be governor. Really, but he wouldn't take it. Chapter 6 is interesting. Let me begin any thoughts about this chapter by saying this. The wall is not finished until the gates are hung. It's not really a wall if you can't close it off. Everybody just run to that opening, they've got it. It's a straight shot. So you get to the beginning of chapter 6, and guess what? The wall is complete, but the gates are not hung. So the enemy sees the last great opportunity to derail this plan to rebuild the city. And what they do is repeatedly, they call for Nehemiah to come to the plains of Ono, which is, by the way, is about a day's journey away, so that they can talk to him. Now, we know, because of the text, what we're informed, that their plan was to kill him. That probably bring everything to a pretty good halt right there. Is take the leader out, and you've ended it. But Nehemiah is a wise man, and his response is to say, I'm too busy to come down and chit chat with you folk. I'm not going to do that. So finally, you may notice that Sanballat decides what he's going to do is he's going to send out a letter, and it's an open letter. I don't know how many of you remember, or even maybe yet, watched the Andy Griffith show, and seen, if I recall correctly, there's a spot where the postman comes along and he's handing the mail to Aunt B, and he says, well, I see there that your cousin so-and-so is doing such and such. How'd you see it? Well, he read your postcard. That's how he saw it. He read your information. So Sanballat has this idea, and the idea is I'm going to put Nehemiah on such a spot that he's going to have to come down and talk to us. Of course, Nehemiah is still not going to have anything to do with it. So next, we have in verse 10 a secret informer. And this is Shemaiah. And if you do much research there, he doesn't even belong in the temple. And yet, he's urging Nehemiah, come. They're trying to hurt you. Come, let's go into the temple and we'll hide there. Well, guess what? That's against the law. Nehemiah is not of the tribe of Levi. He's not certainly not of the family of Aaron, and therefore he's not supposed to go in. And what this fellow's trying to get him to do is to violate the law. Let the people kill him. If we can't get him to come to Ono where we can kill him, we'll set him up to where the people will have to kill him because he will have violated the law. And Nehemiah rejects that entirely. And then, interestingly enough, in verse 14, he says, my God, remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these works, and the prophetess Noadiah and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid. They're trying to scare him and get him to do what's wrong. And he says, God, and remember, there's our word again, right? Remember them. And see, before he wants to be remembered for good, what about these folks? He wants them, God, you take care of them. No, there's a message there for us, brethren. It's not our job to get even. It's not our job to get revenge. Let God take care of it. If you read the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, you're going to see him practicing the same thing. He'll ask, God take care of them. By the way, you'll see others that occasionally will say, God, remember what they did. Take care of them. Deal with it. That's the way it ought to be. Good men of God do that. All right, verse 15, one of the big verses in the whole book. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. Now, if you study that wall, that was some more accomplishment. I happen to know we got some folks around here who love to build. Hiram has been our go-to guy, except this year you happen to have a grandchild this year. But our go-to guy in designing and helping kind of lead the construction at VBS is Hiram. But Hiram, you spend more than 52 days on it. Now, I'm not talking about the actual building. I'm talking about planning and all. Nehemiah, this is everything for him. Lock, stock, and barrel. That's a pretty good job. When you consider the dimensions of that city, it's a massive job that has been accomplished. I want to remind you of early on. What do you say? The people have a mind to work. You can get a lot done when folks are ready to work. If somebody wants to drag their feet and hold their wagon back, it's going to slow us down. But if we all get busy and go to work, then good things will happen. All right, get over to chapter 7 then. And notice he there reaffirms that he built the wall and hung the doors. And then he begins to go into an extended list of the people who were a part of all of this, who returned to Jerusalem. And one author, I think I've got it in your notes, suggested that Jerusalem may have been the most devastated part of all of Israel. And that's somewhat logical, because it was the last stronghold of the Jewish people before Nebuchadnezzar defeated them. By the way, how many times did he beat Jerusalem? 3 times. It took till the 3rd time to finally finish them off. And his normal course, Nebuchadnezzar's normal course was go in, beat a country, and take all the young leaders away, and you got them. Well, it doesn't work that way with the Jews. He took all the young and all the leadership away, and guess what? The next level took over. And so he has to come back and he goes after them again. And he hauls them off and just leaves. No, that didn't work either. And you see much the same problem later. The Jews, typically have that approach. You'll find it again at the destruction of Jerusalem. They follow that same basic path. Okay. At the end of that chapter, with all that list of people, at verse 73, so the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, singers, some of the people, the Nethinim, and all Israel dwelt in their cities. When the 7th month came, the children of Israel were in their cities. So now everybody's been able to go home. Why? The wall's built. They don't have to stay in Jerusalem to protect the city anymore, which Nehemiah had asked them to do earlier. And so what happens? Verse 1, now all the people gathered together as one man in the open square that was in front of the water gate, and they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded Israel. So Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly of men and women and all who could hear with understanding on the first day of the 7th month. What is that day? Well, if you study the law, you're going to discover it's the Feast of Trumpets. That's what it is. But they didn't know that. I'm not talking about Ezra didn't know it, but the people didn't know it. See, right now, they're just wanting to hear the law. They're wanting to become reacquainted with who they are. They've been off in Babylon, and they've forgotten who they are. Brethren, there's a warning here, isn't there? If we don't constantly teach and reteach, we're going to discover that we finally reach a point where we don't know who we are or what we're about. And that's the same problem that happened after Joshua died in the book of Judges, which we'll be covering on Sunday mornings. It happened because they quit following the law. So what did he do? Well, they built a platform. You think, what we have here, something like that maybe. Built a platform, and he began to read the law to everybody who could understand. He stood on the platform, and as he did that, now look at this, verse 8. So they read distinctly from the book of the law of God, and they gave the sense and helped them understand the reading. Wait a minute. Law of Moses is written in Hebrew. What's the language of the Jews? Aramaic. See, they've been to Babylon, and now they've come home, and they don't know Hebrew anymore. And so they've got to read it and then give the sense of it. They got to explain it to people because they don't understand the language. Very, very interesting that they would pursue that in that way. So they're now beginning to follow the law and listen to the law. Skip on down now to verses 13 and following. Now on the second day, the heads of the fathers' houses of all the people, with the priests and the Levites, were gathered to Ezra the scribe in order to understand the words of the law. One writer, Chuck Horner, did this for World Video Bible School. You can watch it. It's free online. Just go to thebible.net and look for videos on the Bible, and you'll find Chuck Horner. He was tremendous in the books that he did. He says this is a teacher's meeting. Well, he's really right, because guess who's supposed to teach people about the law? The scribes and the priests. But they don't know the law themselves. So you got to have a teacher's meeting to teach them what it is. And I thought that was an interesting way to put it. And they found written in the law, which the Lord had commanded by Moses, that the children of Israel should dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month, and that they should announce and proclaim in all their cities and in Jerusalem, saying, go out to the mountain and bring olive branches, branches of oil trees, myrtle branches, palm branches, and branches of leafy trees to make booths as it is written. So guess what? They're learning of another feast. It's called the Feast of Booths. And they're just now realizing, hey, this is the month to celebrate. Imagine somebody coming to you and saying, I'm sorry, what? Feast of Tabernacles is another way it can be and is translated, by the way, in some translations. And what it basically means is they lived in tents throughout that feast. And it's a reminder of what? It's kind of a reminder of their journey through the wilderness, among other things. It's a reminder where they came from, if you want to put it that way. So that's what they're doing here. So the people understand. Imagine now, tomorrow is July the 1st. Imagine that we start reading the history books. We get Mr. Chris, who's a history teacher, and we say, tell us about our history. And we discover that 4th of July is a big day. And we decide, well, we're going to celebrate then. See, that's what's happening here. Now, it's designated by God. It's not just something that's part of the tradition of the nation. It's designated by God. But they had forgotten the instructions for observing this Feast of Tabernacles, or if you would, the Feast of Booths. I'll go to chapter 9. Chapter 9, it's very significant that beginning in verse 1, we find now on the 24th day of this month, the children of Israel were assembled with fasting and sackcloth and with dust on their heads. Then those of the Israelite lineage separated themselves from all the foreigners, and they stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. And they stood up in their place and read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for 1/4 of the day, and for another fourth they confessed and worshiped the Lord their God. Do you notice that 2 men are not mentioned here? Ezra and Nehemiah. This apparently is the people wanting to do what God wants them to do, and they pursue this on their own, at least again, you go by the text. That's the way you do that. You know, Jesus said, or talked about, Melchizedek, or more especially, that was talked about in the letter to the Hebrew Christians, and it says, he's without father and without mother, without beginning of days or end of life. Do you think Melchizedek really didn't have a birthday? No. But it's not reported in the Old Testament, is it? We don't know who his parents are. We don't know if he had any children, do we? Why not? The book doesn't tell us. So, I'm going to assume Ezra and Nehemiah aren't there. Why? No record that they're there. So the people are trying to do what's right. I kind of like that. I like to hear that and realize that. And so, beginning at verse 6, we have the Levites leading the people in a prayer. And as far as a specific recorded prayer, this is the longest prayer in all of the Bible. Now, there may have been a longer one. This is just the longest record that we have of one. And what are they doing? Well, the people are praying to God, and they're begging for forgiveness of their sins. And based upon that, then God responds to them as He said He would. He's going to bless them. They're going to be forgiven. All right, chapter 10 is the covenant and the signers of the covenant that they make with God. And these are all the various leaders of the people who sign the covenant in behalf of the people. That's what this chapter is all about. 83 or more signers are represented all the people of Judah. That's what Holcroft says, and if you go through and count them, you'll see that he was right with his numbers. The simple covenant they signed is expressed in verse 29. Let's look at 28 and 29. Now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the Nethinim, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, everyone who had knowledge and understanding, these joined with their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and observe to do all the commandments of the Lord our God and His ordinances and His statutes. What's the covenant? We're going to do what you say. Now, I want to remind us, we've talked about this over and over again, it's one thing you don't ever want to forget. God forms a covenant. There always are at least 2 elements. Element number 1, promises. Element number 2, conditions. These people are signing a covenant that says, we will keep the conditions. We will obey the law. That's what they're doing. Now, you don't have to go very far in this book before you find out they didn't quite do as well as they intended to. Is there anybody in here that ever has that problem? You know, you set out to do something, I'm determined I'm going to. Yeah, I think we all do at some point or another. And these people are, unfortunately, in that regard, no exception. So they did make a commitment, though, not to intermarry with foreigners. So verse 30, we would not give our daughters as wives to the peoples of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. Why? because even Solomon, when he married women who did not know or worship God, even Solomon was led off into sin. Brethren, we really ought to stress to our young people the importance of marrying a Christian. Somebody who will help you go to heaven. There's no New Testament absolute requirement of that. I can show you the principle laid out pretty good, though, that is there. And we need to work on that. Encourage our children. I love when Colin's up here for 9 good minutes on Sunday afternoons, and you notice, I think about the last question he asks every time is, who are you going to marry? And they all shout out, a Christian, and that's what we want. We want our children to marry Christians. Life will present you enough problems even if you're married to a Christian. Yeah. Okay, so Bob is reminding us that when they went into Canaan, they weren't supposed to give their daughters to the people that lived there, nor were they supposed to take their sons as sons-in-law, And what did they do? They ignored that. What did it cost them? Well, it cost them the land, didn't it? That's why they went into exile. So it's an important thing to notice. All right, chapter 11 is an interesting chapter because they've got to get more people live in Jerusalem. What good is a giant walled city if you haven't got enough folks to live there and protect the place and keep it a vibrant city? And so they end up selecting 468 common men of Judah, 928 common men of Benjamin, 1,192 priests, and I'll give you the figures there, 284 Levites, and 172 gatekeepers. And then you get a listing of the towns, and I am not going to read a listing of the towns, not because it's not a good thing. Teresa and I read it in our Bible reading, but it seems very repetitious, and we don't know all those places that it's talking about. Chapter 12 is the dedication of the temple. There's a list reporting the priestly families that were involved in this, and that opens up the chapter. There's a list of the second generation. In other words, the priests are going to die sometime, so who's going to take over? Well, second generation. These are listed for us. And then the dedication of the temple, which involves singing and sacrifice and great joy. I want you to notice particularly verse 43. Love this verse, chapter 12 of Nehemiah. Also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard far off. You'd think Nehemiah was impressed with all the happiness, with all the joy. They finally were at home. They finally had the walls of the city built, and their nation, they felt, was restored. And in many ways it was. Now, they're going to have trouble again later. That's some of the things that we will see as we go on in this study together on Wednesday nights. But for this time, for right now, they have joy. Okay, at the end of the chapter, Nehemiah's got a task to take care of. It is a task laid out in the law of Moses. He picks it up, verse 44. And at the same time, some were appointed over the rooms of the storehouse for the offerings, the first fruits, and the tithes, to gather into them from the fields of the cities the portions specified by the law for the priests and Levites. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and Levites who ministered. Both the singers and the gatekeepers kept the charge of their God and the charge of the purification according to the command of David and Solomon his son. For in the days of David and Asaph of old, There were chiefs of the singers and songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. And by the way, Asaph is one of the writers of some of the Psalms. If you get into Psalms, you're going to see Asaph. You see David's name a lot, I know. But you'll see Asaph's name. He was a writer of songs as well. In the days of Zerubbabel and the days of Nehemiah, all Israel gave the portions for the singers and the gatekeepers, a portion for each day. They also consecrated the holy things for the Levites, and the Levites consecrated them for the children of Aaron. Okay. How many are going to keep on doing your job if they never pay you? I don't know anybody. I mean, if you got to make a living, don't you? If you got to go out and dig ditches or whatever, and by the way, I'm not opposed to that. I've done some of that. If that's what you got to do, well, fine. So what Nehemiah's doing is making arrangements so the priests and Levites will stay. What you don't want them to do is for them to all run back to see their cities, remember, that are designated to the priests, to the priestly tribe. And around those cities is some farmland that they're allowed to use, keep their herds and keep their crops, grow their crops there. If you don't feed them, what are they going to do? They're going to have to go home and find something to eat. It's just that simple. So Nehemiah follows the law. And what does the law say? Well, the tithes that come in, those are for the priests. And so forth. And that's what he's doing. He's just keeping the law as it was written. All right, chapter 13. On that day, Holcroft says the better translation would be in that era. See, we sometimes talk about days of yesteryear or something like that. And we're talking about a whole span of time, aren't we? We're not really talking about just a few days or one day. And that's what's going on here. We've got an era. This is after the completion of the temple. That's what he's talking about. On that day, they read from the book of Moses in their hearing of the people. And in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God, because they had not met the children of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So it was, when they had heard the law, that they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. There is a Moabite that is allowed into Israel, and her descendants, before the regular length of time, are allowed to go into the temple. Who is it? It's Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. Now why? See, for up to the 10th generation, they're not supposed to enter the temple. Guess what? David's before the 10th generation. He couldn't go in the tabernacle, couldn't go there to worship. If you follow that law strictly, what's the difference? See, what'll happen is you'll have somebody throw this at you, and they'll say, look, there's a contradiction. Well, no, there's not a contradiction. Because if you study the book of Ruth, you're going to see that she places herself under the wing of God. And in fact, if you remember, her husband-to-be comments on that. And you may also remember the most famous, probably, quote in the whole book is, thy people should be my people, and thy God, my God. So what did she do? She's a proselyte. She's not a Moabitess anymore. By birth she is, but she has made herself a Jew. She's put herself under the wing of God. And that's very, very important to realize. Had she not have done that, then David could not have gone into the presence of the Lord, and which he did often, by the way. So we have to have an explanation. Well, we do. You know, she was a proselyte. She put herself under the will of God, unlike some others who had come along later as well. So Nehemiah went off back to Persia. Remember, at the very outset, in the early going, when the king said, well, how long do you want to go? He set a time. Now, we don't know the length of that time, but we know he did set a time. Well, in this chapter, what we run into is he's gone back to Persia. Now, you pick up about verse 4. Now, before this, Eliashib, the priest, having authority over the storerooms of the house of our God, was allied with Tobiah. Now, Tobiah is an Ammonite. Is Tobiah supposed to live in the temple? You can nod your head this way. No. In fact, you remember Nehemiah wouldn't even go in there himself. And yet this non-Israelite, this Ammonite, Tobiah, is living there. And notice what Eliashib did. And he had prepared for him a large room where previously they had stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the articles, the tithes of grain, the new wine and oil, which were commanded to be given to the Levites and singers and gatekeepers, and the offerings for the priests. But during all this, I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Then, after certain days, I obtained leave from the king. And I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah in preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me bitterly. Therefore, I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. Does that remind you of anybody else? Jesus. Bob said it. That's exactly right. When they see something doesn't fit God's will, boy, you can see their anger come up. Now, it's not out of control anger. There's out of control anger leads to sin, and we're not supposed to do that. But it is acceptable to have, sometimes we call it righteous indignation. Because the point is, it's how you exercise it. Jesus didn't kill anybody, but he threw them out. Nehemiah doesn't kill anybody, but he throws Tobiah out, doesn't he? And we need to see that. We need to see the importance of cleaning house for God, so to speak. You might say Nehemiah is involved in some spring cleaning. And he doesn't stop there. Let's go a little bit further. Then I commanded them to cleanse the rooms, and I brought back into them the articles of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. I also realized that the portions for the Levites had not been given them, for each of the Levites and the singers who did the work had gone back to his field. I told you that's what happened. And that's exactly what did happen, isn't it? If you don't feed me, I got to go home and find some way to eat. Priests needed help. So I contended with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and set them in their place. Then all Judah, what? All Judah brought the tithe of the grain and the new wine and the oil to the storehouse. I said 14 chapters, only 13. So I'll repent and correct myself right now. Okay? So it's 13. And I appointed as treasurers over the storehouse, and he does that. Now watch. When he does that, by the way, they're to distribute to their brethren. That's the end of the 13th verse. Watch verse 14. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I've done for the house of my God and for its services. So how many times in this book does he say remember? It's quite a few, if you track it all down, starting in chapter 1. And all, here in this chapter, we've got it 4 times that he asked God to remember something. In those days, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt there also, brought in fish and all kinds of goods, and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do, by which you profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do thus, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." And so what did he do? Close the gates. We're going to fix this. You can't bring your goods in here because the gate's going to be closed for the whole Sabbath. And that's how we're going to keep you out. He's very, very emphatic in that. And the merchants and sellers, you know what their solution was? Well, if we can't go in, we'll just set up outside the gates. And Nehemiah goes to them and says, "You better get yourself out of here." I'm using my words, but that's the idea, isn't it? You better leave. We're not going to have any of this stuff. You're not going to mess with the Sabbath day. That's the day we honor God. We keep it holy for God. And you're not going to sell things outside Jerusalem that cause people to violate the law. And so, having done that, then you discover, beginning in verse 22, "And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day." Now watch him. "Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy." Nehemiah doesn't claim to be deserving. He just begs God to remember him in a positive way. "In those days I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And half their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one or the other people. So I contended with them and cursed them." And by the way, cursed is called down God's wrath upon them. It's not what you and I think when we think of cursed. That would be improper for him or for anybody else. He pronounced a curse on them, is what we're talking about. May God, deal with you, is the idea. "He struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, saying, 'You shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God. And God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women?' And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law of Sanballat, the Horonite. Therefore I drove him from me." Now, Sanballat's a Horonite. He's not a Jew. And so what you going to do about it? Run him off. Run him off. He's related to the wrong kind of man. So again, remember them, oh my God, because they've defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. So here was a priest married to a foreigner. It's against the law. And Nehemiah chases him off and says, "I hope you remember them too." Not in a good way. "I hope you punish them for what they've done. Then, thus I cleanse them of everything pagan. I also assign duties to the priests and the Levites, each to his service, and to bring the wood offerings and the first fruits at appointed times. Remember me, O my God, for good." Because that's what he did. It's a powerful book. We've gone quickly through it because we want to cover some other things. We will go ahead and probably next week talk about some of the aspects of Daniel's prophecies, which come during the exile, but they concern after the exile. And so we'll look forward to that. If you want to read in Daniel, read chapters 7 through 12. But let me promise you, be prepared to wonder, what in the world am I reading in spots? Because it's quite historical, and frankly, most of us, including me, have not studied that history in detail. Now, I had to teach that book at the school, and so I did study the history. But days gone by, I was totally ignorant about this history. But we're going to look at a little bit of it, Lord willing, next week.